これよりなぜ US インベスターズは日本に価値を見出しているのかをテーマに特別対談を開催いたします。当社グループは日本のバイオヘルスケア領域の優れた技術やパイプラインを海外資本やグローバルネットワークと結びつけるゲートウェイとして投資・事業開発を推進しております。本日は当社米国子会社ナノホールディングス US チェアマンのドクター・ニール・ギブソンと当社チーフビジネスディベロップメントオフィサーの山口が米国投資家から見た日本企業の魅力やグローバル市場における事業機会について対談いたします。まず本日の登壇者をご紹介いたします。ドクター・ニール・ギブソンは30年以上にわたりがん治療領域を中心に4つのブロックバスター医薬品の研究・開発・商業化を主導。世界中の多くの患者の治療結果の向上に貢献してきました。ファイザーオンコロジーのチーフサイエンティフィックオフィサーをはじめ、世界的な製薬企業及びバイオベンチャー企業で CEO、CSO を歴任して成長と成功を主導してきた経営者でもあります。また山口は当社チーフビジネスディベロップメントオフィサーとして日本の優れた技術や事業をグローバル市場へつなぐ事業開発を推進しております。
Okay. So, Hiromi, thank you very much for your kind introduction with a nice picture. So that made me very relaxed. So thanks so much. So I start this session. So the first one, anyways, Neil, thanks so much for coming, joining us today from all the way from the San Diego.
Thank you, Yasu. So what made these drugs successful? First of all, good teams. I've been very fortunate to work with a lot of excellent people. And I think one of the common themes through all these 4 drugs development was constantly challenging dogma and never accepting no as an answer. And what I mean by that is, so Temodar was actually a drug developed based on my PhD thesis many years ago, probably too many, but it was the first oral drug to be used for glioblastoma, so it really changed the paradigm. Most of the drugs up until that time had been cytotoxic agents that were administered intravenously, so we wanted to change that when we were doing the research in the labs. With Nexivar, that drug is a drug that was approved first in HCC. I think the key thing here was that that was the first drug that was approved without causing tumor shrinkage in cancer patients. So up until that time, people used what was known as RECIST criteria to measure tumor shrinkage. And the FDA used that as an endpoint to guide whether they would like to develop and approve a drug. So Nexivar in HCC had a 0% response rate, but we stuck with it, believing in the drug, and it actually improved the progression-free survival of patients with HCC. So that was a really good effort to take a drug that was active and not stop its development just because of one endpoint that didn't actually go the way we would have liked it to go. For Tarceva, that was a really interesting example of an EGFR inhibitor. The first EGFR inhibitor actually approved was Iressa in Japan. That was the first global approval for an EGFR inhibitor in lung cancer. But with Tarceva, we actually spent a lot of time working with Genentech and Roche, 2 big pharmas. Now, they wanted to develop this drug in combination with chemotherapy in a first-line setting. I was at CSO at OSI Pharmaceuticals, and we didn't think that was the right approach. So we actually believed in our own view of this drug and developed this drug in second-line non-small cell lung cancer as a monotherapy. Now, the key here was that we ran a placebo-controlled trial, which was very rare in oncology. Not many placebo-controlled trials are done in oncology. Why was that important? Because there was a prevailing view that the only patients who would respond to an EGFR inhibitor would be female adenocarcinoma patients of Asian heritage with mutations in EGFR. Well, the placebo data showed that that wasn't actually true. Those patients did benefit tremendously from the drug, but male patients responded, squamous cell carcinoma patients responded, patients in the US and Europe responded. So running that placebo-controlled trial allowed us to challenge the dogma of which patients would best respond. And crizotinib, which is Alcori, we'll talk a little bit more later, but that was a drug that Pfizer put into clinical development. Initially, it was a c-MET inhibitor, and we recognized that it also inhibited some other kinases, and ALK kinase being another kinase. It was tenfold less potent against ALK, but because of some pioneering work of Professor Nano here in Japan, we felt that this drug would be better for patients with EML4 ALK translocations, and that's what we did. So the last two agents, Tarceva and crizotinib, were both good examples of getting the right drug to the right patient. And I think, so looking back on what I've been able to be part of, it's challenging dogma and getting the right drug to the right patient have been the key. So thank you. Professor Nano was pivotal in Pfizer's development of crizotinib known as Alcori. And the reason I say that, when we ran the phase 1 trial, we ran that trial with 22 patients, and only 3 patients responded. Pfizer was going to stop the development of that drug, and as I mentioned earlier, it was a c-MET kinase inhibitor, but was tenfold less potent against ALK. At the time that phase 1 data matured, Professor Nano published in Nature a paper that showed that EML4 ALK translocations occurred in about 5% of non-small cell lung cancer patients. So we read that paper and then made the decision to go ahead and genetically profile the tumors from the patients in that phase 1 study. And of the 22 patients, the 3 patients who had EML4 ALK translocations were the 3 patients who responded to the drug. So that was a real eye-opening experience for us. So based upon Professor Nano's Nature paper, we decided to just enroll patients with EML4 ALK translocation into the subsequent trial. There was about 70 patients subsequently treated with drug, and just over 70% of those patients responded to drug. And this was still a phase 1 clinical trial. So based upon that phase 1 data, the FDA approved that drug. So it was the first time that the FDA had approved a drug based upon phase 1 clinical trial. And the key finding that drove the development of that drug was actually Professor Nano's paper in Nature showing EML4 ALK translocations in non-small cell lung cancer.
So the question here is, can Japan create world-class innovation? So how do you answer it?
Yes, I answer it. You see it on this slide.
Answer,
I mean, and take Professor Honjo's work. I mean, he's impacted hundreds of thousands of patients, improving their quality of life and giving them better quality of life and longer lifespan. He's changed the standard of care in multiple different cancer indications, and he's actually been a driver for benefiting Bristol Myers Squibb in terms of their revenue that they've generated from Opdivo, the commercial antibody that targets PD-1. So Japanese science does drive value, and it is innovative. So this is, I don't look at deals as much as I look at how much is invested into science and technology. And so I went back and I checked. In the last 20 years in the US, there's been about $130 billion spent on what's called Series A and Series B financings in biotech. So that's to stimulate biotech growth. Subsequently, there's been another $110 or more billion spent on IPOs as biotech companies transition from private to public entities. When I checked the numbers for Japan, there's probably about $3 billion spent on Series A, Series B, and about $1.5 to $2 billion spent on IPOs in the biotech community. So that's a huge gap in financing between the two countries. And I think what's happening with China, when I was at Pfizer, I was asked to spend 30 to 40% of my budget outside those walls. So outside the walls of Pfizer. So I had to spend a lot of time going to China and trying to identify groups that we could work with. So China's seen tremendous growth just because of, one, the cost of labor in China was attractive to the US groups, but also because they started to really do science very well. They're really good at sort of mimicking or copying research that has been done elsewhere and taking advantage of that. Unlike Japan, which does really innovative stuff, I think surprising when I saw this picture that there wasn't as much deal structure coming out of Japan. And probably the numbers that prevent that line from going to zero are because Daiichi Sankyo has done some really good work on their ADC technology and generated some significant deals with US pharma. When I was at Pfizer, Pfizer was spending about $8 billion a year on R&D. So over a 10-year period, they would put about 80 billion of their money into investing in R&D. So you can see now that the gap in how much money is invested in the science and in the technology is really the gap that needs to change, and getting access to some of that US capital, I think, would be very pivotal for allowing Japan to really build upon its innovation. The US is just a huge economy, and that's really what's driving this. And if you look at a lot of the M&A activity that you've highlighted, I mean, all the major pharmas in the US are trying to replenish their portfolios, whether it's through patent cliffs or just lack of their internal R&D organizations delivering. So they're looking for quality assets, they're looking for quality science, quality clinical data, and basically trying to identify that, whether it be in Europe, whether it be in Asia, etc. So I think why US investors, specifically biotech investors, are getting excited about Japan, I think you have to applaud what the Japanese government is trying to do, where it's stimulating the investment into biotech and pharma through programs like AMED. I think that's a really good example of how you can create a positive environment for investment. You see a number of US investors are now AMED certified. I think there's more than 15 US investors are AMED certified. That includes top tier US investor groups like RA Capital, OrbiMed, MPM. So obviously they see what the government is doing as being an attractive feature. We've already talked about the quality of the science that goes on in Japan, so that's another attractive feature. And when these things come together, US investors see the opportunity to create significant value. So I think that's why a lot of the US investors are starting to pay more and more attention to Japanese science and Japanese technology and trying to be part of that success. I think the key from a US perspective is novelty and innovation. When you look at oncology, you can see whether it's PD-1 antibodies, there's probably been 30 to 40 PD-1 antibodies evaluated. There's probably been 30 to 40 TIGIT antibodies developed. When you look at TIGIT, this is a drug that's failed in multiple clinical trials for antibodies against TIGIT, and yet there's been probably 30 to 40,000 patients being exposed to a TIGIT antibody that is basically ineffective. So that's because there's been so many of these antibodies developed that they just take up patients, they use patients. So we need to drive innovation and do things slightly differently than try and evaluate the 30th PD-1 antibody or the 30th TIGIT antibody, because data tells us that that's not the right way to go. So basically, I think that's why we really need to focus on innovation.
So I think here Nano's role. So Nano became a strategic investment company, but Nano's role as a gateway, we are connecting the Japanese asset to capital, business development, and exit opportunities. So we will be contributing to the global value creation. So the left-hand side is, of course, we confirm that Japan has world-class science. We have so many good pharma biotech assets, and also maybe the carve-out opportunities from the existing Japanese industries other than pharmaceutical companies. So the Nano Gateway is what I'm using particularly for this purpose is we call it as a Nano Value Creation Platform. There are four important pillars. Sourcing is very important, good science, technology, but capital is also very important. And then we have the capability to edit, to create, add more value, and then exit. So this is how we are doing. So build investable opportunities. That's very important. And then we connect them to the global ecosystem. So that is US VC and the investors. So thanking for you, we are currently actively talking with around 20 strong US investors for this purpose. And so also we are aiming to have as an exit global farmer partners, maybe by IPO, M&A, or some deals for as an exit. But this is in the context of the kind of the investment, but this is truly contributing to the patient health by having the good science to become a great medicine to treat patients. So I think Nano, not just as a gateway, we will be contributing to the patient health worldwide. So would you like to comment on?
I think I've had the pleasure of working with Kato-san, where we're talking with a lot of US investor groups. And what's really striking is the response rate we've been getting is very high from US investors. So normally when I was trying to raise capital for one of the companies I'd probably be lucky if I got 10% of the groups I emailed would respond. Here we're getting a very high traction rate. And what's interesting is some of those venture groups have physical facilities in Japan, but others don't. And the ones that don't have physical facilities need an opportunity to be able to figure out what assets or what technologies are present in Japan. And I think Nano can provide that link for those investor groups. So very excited about the opportunity to help Nano interact with a number of US investors and to help US investors identify quality assets that can improve patients' lives coming out of Japan.
So then, this is the last slide, takeaway message. So Obviously, world-class science exists in Japan. US investors are paying attention. Connection creates value. So capital plus business development plus networks, those are very important. And Nano's roles as a gateway and a connection.
Most of the US investors have a sort of focus on early clinical data. In essence, they want to de-risk their investment in a way where they like to see clinical data as a sort of helping them make a decision type of information. Now, having said that, in the US, there's certain groups will invest mainly in clinical data. Other groups will invest in early stage programs, like the ones you were talking about where you're trying to extract value out of IP. I was fortunate to start 3 companies in the US where we tried to talk to one academic group about licensing their IP, but their perception of value wasn't the same as the perception that we had of the value of that IP. So we actually went ahead and ran the company and created our own IP. So there's a balance in terms of which groups invest in which stage of assets. I've been fortunate enough, I have been experienced the whole spectrum of early stage programs, clinical stage programs, and even been involved in commercialization of programs. So the key, as you highlighted though, is to really make sure you can get a significant patent estate around the technology or the asset. And that's really what is valuable to a lot of different investors. I mean, I'm not really sure there is a solution because it depends on one's risk appetite, right? And what you see in the US is a cyclical pattern where I was fortunate at a company I worked with where I was the CSO called Regulus Therapeutics. We were the first preclinical company to be able to go through an IPO in about 10 years when we did it back in about 2011, 2012. And that's because the investors weren't investing in early stage programs. So, and we're in that sort of phase at the moment where they're really wanting to focus on clinical data. It's almost a show me sort of investment strategy where they want almost to see clinical proof of concept before they're really willing to invest a significant amount of money. Now, having said that, there are smaller groups in the US. I was fortunate to work with one called Avalon Bioventures that created their own incubator, and that's where we could start companies right from scratch. Whether we licensed in an asset or not, we just basically tried to build our own IP. And 2 of the companies I started, we were able to get to an IND for about $12 million cost. So that was a lot of work being done by CROs under the guidance of the team that I was running. So it's just finding the right groups who are willing to take the risk to invest in early stage assets versus some of the larger US VCs who really want that clinical data to help drive their investment decision. So I can't give you an answer because I'm not sure there is a solution. Yeah, I mean, I think that gets back to part of what the Nano strategy is, which is trying to identify those type of assets, maybe even restructure the asset, whether it's into a new co or create a US subsidiary as a way to create a vehicle to allow US investment to come in. And if it's done through a new co that could also maybe benefit from AMED funding, I think that's how you can then generate the clinical data that you think a potential acquirer may want to see, right? So it's trying to restructure the program in a way that you can bring in new financing to create or generate the data that you really need to make it an attractive acquisition target. But I think it's identifying where that drug works best and maybe doing then a focused clinical study to generate that data. So there are a number of companies in Japan that have got really nice clinical data, and when you look at some of the subset analysis, it's really striking that there's a subset of patients who really respond effectively to that drug, whereas others might not benefit as much. So trying to focus in on those patients and get stronger clinical data, I think, is the right way to do that. And then if you can do that in a capital efficient way, I think that's the key, and I think you can do that, right? So that would be, again, taking advantage of knowing that information, and then whether it's creating the new code to be able to run some studies in the US or elsewhere to generate a broader clinical data set that would help stimulate future investment into that asset. So I think it's feasible, and it's surprising how many Japanese companies actually have clinical sites as part of their development program over in the US. So a lot of the Japanese companies have already thought ahead and have got data that is relevant and will be acceptable to the FDA, for instance. I think it just means that you need to invest a little bit more to broaden out that patient population. I mean, you've seen the US FDA pay a lot of attention to Chinese data because they're worried about the reproducibility of that data and the relevance of that data to the broader US population. So I think it just means that you need to do a little bit more clinical trial work to get that right data set that you need to make the asset more attractive. And I've had discussions with Ino-san and Matsumura-san, and they've all been focused on making sure we can identify the quality asset. And a market opportunity doesn't need to be huge to allow you to have a good return on your investment. So for instance, the crizotinib story, 5% of those non-small cell lung cancer patients, which is only about 8,000 patients in the US, but that still allowed that drug to be profitable and generate significant revenue. So I think my message would be to management, it's making sure we can find the quality assets that are really worth the investing to make sure that there is a return on that investment. And it doesn't need to be a large patient population, it's just quality of the program that will give that return on the investment.
Okay, so if you don't have any more questions, I would like to close and hand over to you guys.
So thank you everyone for taking the time to listen and be here.